Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt in session with Dr. Tara Hickey. Tara is a clinical psychologist who originates from Ireland via the UK to the USA and back again, finding herself in Melbourne, Australia, and now in Western Country, Victoria. Tara has a lot of experience working with young people who are at risk of psychosis. She recently completed her PhD, which involved a preliminary investigation into a mindfulness and compassion-focused approach to working with young people. She's a skilled clinician, a clever researcher, and she reminds us to bring our compassion to all living beings and to the planet that we live on. I hope you enjoy my conversation in session with my friend, Dr. Tara Hickey. Well, welcome, Dr. Tara Hickey, to Compassion in a T-shirt in session. I'm very pleased that we got to chat. We're actually on the same time zone, which is cool because quite often I'm talking to people who are all over the place. But so you're in country Victoria, is that right?
I am. So I was living the last 10 years in Melbourne, but like a lot of people in Melbourne, of course, we all decided to have a bit of a country escape.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have moved to Western Victoria in recent months.
Yeah, right. So I think we first. I'm actually not sure when we met because we've sort of bumped into each other a lot over the years, but absolutely you were involved with the Compassion Symposium a couple of times and came up and presented with that. I think you're also quite involved with the Compassionate Mind Australia. Is that correct too?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm one of the committee members for CMA.
One of the committee members for CMA. And you've been doing your wonderful PhD, and I think that's relatively recently all come to fruition and sort of completed that sometime last year. So I'm actually really hoping to hear a little bit about that as well over the conversation today. But how are things down there in country Victoria today? Is it getting chilly?
It is starting to, definitely. You certainly notice it in the mornings, but I can't complain. We still get some nice sun in the afternoon, and it's just really nice to be able to be out in the mountains or just really kind of escape, to all the stuff the countryside has to offer, really. So no complaints this end.
Yeah, is that man from Snowy River country or no?
No, so I'm more Western. I'm past the Grampians, more out that direction.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I always like to just sort of check in and sort of see if people can, just tell if you can tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, I know I'm very perceptive, but I can sort of tell there's a somewhat of an accent there, so I'm not sure. But so tell us a little bit about yourself, Tara. What's the story there?
Well, I was just thinking it's probably a bit of a blended accent by this stage. So I did grow up in Dublin and I moved to the UK where I did my clinical training at the University of Birmingham. I was really fortunate when I was there. They gave you an opportunity that if you were able to get all your academic work done, that you could do your last 6 months placement as an overseas placement. So I got to hang out or to train in Bellevue Hospital in New York City. So needless to say, that was great fun. And then I returned to the UK and I did a stint in London, but I really felt like I just wanted to try something else outside the NHS. And the work I was doing at the time originated in Melbourne. So I was like, oh, well, why don't I try Australia? Why don't I try Melbourne? Brought me this side and I really liked it. I was like, this is like, had been my favorite place I'd lived so far. So ended up staying a lot longer than I intended, and here I am.
Right. Yeah. What was the work that you were doing that brought you here?
So at the time when I was in London, I was working in an early intervention team for youth with psychotic symptoms. And of course, it all began the early intervention of psychoses in EPIC or Origin Youth Health in Melbourne. So is that kind of brought me here. I obviously no longer work there anymore, but it was certainly the work that was my main focus at the time.
So working with young people who were sort of showing those early kind of signs of perhaps developing a psychotic disorder, and trying to have some early interventions there.
Yeah, so we're working from individuals all the way to what you call the at-risk mental state. So people that you basically had a higher than average risk of developing psychosis. So, they may hear a murmur or a voice, but it wasn't maybe often or frequent enough to be seen as a full-blown psychotic symptom. They may have a very mild kind of suspicious and paranoia, again, not frank psychotic symptom. So, and we're really kind of being quite watchful in that way, and obviously also trying to be very preventive in terms of them transitioning or to further develop psychosis down the track, as well as individuals who have experienced their first episode of psychosis as well. So really, yes, those kind of early days in that experience.
There was some early warning signs, or some people had actually experienced a first episode. So in those initial days working in that area, what were some of the main approaches you were taking back then?
Wow, it just makes me think about how much has changed.
I wondered about that. Yeah, I wonder whether that had happened.
Yeah, because, when I trained, I also did a placement with the early intervention service in Birmingham. So that's actually where it started in terms of the UK. It had looked at EPIC, it had brought the model across the UK, and they developed it there. And we're predominantly using, I was at least in my training, and I think a lot of other practitioners, cognitive behavioral therapy. I actually set a mindfulness-based stress reduction course myself when I was in London. It was purely for personal benefit. And actually, one of the things I began to think about was how helpful this would be for individuals who are experiencing voices or paranoia. And I remember having a conversation with a client and then bringing it to supervision. And it was about how to use mindfulness with the voices that this chap was experiencing. And I remember a supervisor saying, these are sounding like some really fruitful discussions. So I suppose it really began to kind of, draw my attention to, well, how do we use mindfulness with psychotic symptoms? And really that's in a way where my compassion journey began. Because when I did the MBSR course, there was one section or one section of the session that focused on loving kindness. And of course, the extension from that in terms of, how do we care for ourselves when we're suffering, being kind of compassion, that had really, again, ignited my interest. And I heard, and I can't remember how, about Chris Germer's and Christian Neff's Mindful Self-Compassion course. So that brought me to the US a couple of times to train as a mindful self-compassion teacher. But of course, MSc is really designed for the general population. And it was actually then through social media where, a colleague back in the UK posted this photo of her young daughter reading her book upside down, and it was of compassion-focused therapy. It was Paul's Distinctive Series. And I was like, oh, that looks really interesting. There's compassion for therapy. I really must go check that out. And that's really how I began to be able to kind of combine, my interest of mindfulness and compassion in terms of bringing it to a therapeutic approach, particularly around psychosis at the time.
Yeah, I love how you sort of almost followed your nose a little bit. You were obviously working in this area and already quite passionate about it, and doing the CBT thing, which was certainly an evidence-based approach in that area, and so on. But personally, just sort of exploring other approaches, and mindfulness led to compassion, led to mindful self-compassion. And then, yes, this sort of, the upside down book kind of turned your world upside down.
Very true.
And all of a sudden there you are kind of, compassion as a therapy. And there was this sort of, like almost like a little revelation, all these bits coming together. So what happened next then with CFT for you?
Well, at the time, I was going back to Europe to visit family. And I thought, well, this could be a perfect opportunity to train. So I emailed Paul Gilbert and I said, like, would you happen to be doing any training in the UK at this time that I could attend? You know, he emailed back, and what he said to me is, no, I'm not, but I'm actually in Copenhagen. I thought, oh, I could go there. Haven't been there before. So I joined in, and some people in Copenhagen very generously allowed me to join their training. And I did the introduction and an advanced course there. And what was really fortunate about that, of course, because Paul wasn't really coming to Australia regularly at that point. So when he did start to come, then I got to do his, you know, the personal practice workshops, or the more advanced ones, such as the chair workshop. So since, it's been really good to be able to do some more workshops locally when Paul has visited too. So
he's so good like that, isn't he? Like if you email him, he really, he will often respond and give suggestions, and he's very generous with his thoughts and ideas, but also time. But yes, that's sort of remarkable, really. There you are. You've got a very adventurous spirit by the sounds of it. You've been all over the place. And here was an opportunity to do the training in Copenhagen.
Well, that was all organic too. So
it's all organic. That's right. It just, you know, one thing kind of leads to another, and so then your PhD was actually then really trying to, I think, bring all this together, the work with early intervention, the mindfulness, the compassion-based stuff. So tell us a bit about the PhD.
Yeah, that really came about again where I did actually before I was trained in CFT, I'd been running some MBSR courses for just youth in general in Origin Youth Health. So it could be depression, it could be psychosis, it could have been from the BPD clinic. And really finding it, I think one of the things with youth services is it's always hard to get people to attend groups. But one of the things I was actually told when I finished up my work there was actually the MBSR was the most well-attended group they had run at that point. So that was really encouraging to hear. And of course, here I had done CFT that thought, wow, what extra can we kind of bring to this? So that made me kind of think about, well, how could I put together a mindfulness and compassion group that would meet the needs of these young people? At the time, I was originally looking at the at-risk mental state, but we did then go to include it with people in the early stages of psychosis. But what I began to do, of course, is kind of look through the literature in terms of, you know, what is it that we really need to target and think of in terms of being useful for these young people. And I suppose some of the things that really came out were things like, of course, problems with motivation, difficulties with relationships, and also in terms of course school or university struggling. And of course, you know, the age group I was working with at the time is 15 to 25, which is just such an important time of life in terms of your trajectory. So to try to keep young people on their trajectory as close as possible was really important. So basically what I did then was think about, okay, what are all the things I've learned, whether they're practices or theories or models, and how can I apply it to what these young people could really do support with? So, like, I suppose a lot of, you know, programs, I designed it as an 8-week program, is an hour and a half per week. And the first 4 weeks are very much in terms of helping people learn mindfulness skills, because I suppose, first of all, you need to notice what's going on to be able to respond. Then middle weeks are very much in terms of learning the 3 emotional regulation systems from CFT, and then also thinking about how they would relate to psychotic symptoms or anything else that the young person was struggling with. And then the remaining weeks is actually about how do you respond with compassion. So how do you motivate yourself with compassion? How do you actually bring compassion to your relationships with others? And actually, how do you, you know, in terms of bring it into your life in terms of helping you in terms of whether it's school or job or whatever that might be. So trying to get a little bit more kind of practical in that way.
Okay, so it's really a combination of some of the mindfulness-based work and the CFT sort of psychoeducation, but also the skills kind of bit. Just going back a little bit, any kind of ideas about what might have made the MBSR, better attended, I guess, by the young people?
I mean, I have to say, one of the first things that comes to my mind really is that at the time, I suppose mindfulness has really got to be a bit of a buzzword. So I'm sure that no doubt probably helped. But yeah, I also think for young people, one of the things that they commented on numerous times was basically this idea that I thought it was just my mind that worked like this, as in there was something kind of wrong with their mind, or there's something not quite right. But then they began to realize, oh, everybody's mind actually works very similarly, and it's not just me. And one of the other things that they began to learn is that they began to learn about themselves by actually being able to observe and listen to others. So it really was this back and forth learning between their own experience of the practice, but also to listening to other people's experience.
Yes, mindfulness really itself begins that process of de-shaming in a way, and becoming more and more aware of one's own mind, but also in that group format, becoming more aware of the minds of others in a sense, and then this kind of, well, I guess, common humanity that starts to develop out of that, and even the mindfulness based approach, kind of can create some of that. And then there's the sort of, I guess, the three systems and some of the core psychoeducation of CFT. How was that kind of received?
I found that the young people really took to that model. It really made sense for them. And it actually was part of the program that, particularly in smaller groups, it seems that, the individuals, the youth, they get to know each other more, they feel safer among each other. And they were very keenly listening to other people's experiences in terms of their psychotic symptoms, but you could also tell they're waiting also to contribute when it's kind of that kind of space became available and talk about their experience. And actually, they're saying that it was the first time they've actually got to talk to other people, young people who've had these experiences. And also they said they felt safe, and they could do it in a group or a situation where they didn't feel judged. And that was definitely also a common theme among the groups that I did run. So I felt like it worked really well. It really was a conversation opener,
Well, there was the safeness, first of all, wasn't there? That sense of safeness in the group. And then there was a kind of an opportunity to hear other people's experiences, and also almost a kind of an eagerness, or at least a readiness to share their own experience. But then there was this sort of model, I guess, that was able to make a little bit of sense of it, perhaps, or something like that. I mean, when you think about psychosis or some of the things people experience there, and the three circles model, how do you see those sort of fitting together, or what's your thoughts with that?
I think it's an area that there's still a lot of research on, in terms of psychosis and CFT, and then three models. We're still relatively in them early stages. But one of the things, like, I feel in terms of it being particularly relevant is, of course, when people hear voices, they generally tend to be very critical of and critical of the individual who's experiencing them. Whether they're saying, oh, you're so stupid, or you can't do this, or really derogatory, and, as you can imagine, extremely difficult to live with. But also in terms of paranoia, not only do you feel like the world isn't safe and that people are out potentially to get you, but also people who experience paranoia tend to be more self-attacking. So you could look at threat in terms of externally, in terms of what does that mean for somebody with psychosis, like the world is out to get me, but also internally. So they're also in terms of being more self-attacking. And the voices are also very critical as well. So, them three systems are really helpful in terms of being able to think about it from that perspective.
Mm.
And of course, when that happens and there's a real struggle, real burden to be kind of harassed, sometimes by voices throughout the day, of course, it really compromised people's drive system. And that sense of safety, of course, was also going to be very much diminished. So it was really in terms of helping people understand that the threat system was overdeveloped. One of the things, I remember learning through mindful self-compassion, this idea about perhaps how is this kind of dialogue, or in this instance, voice, trying to help you, even if it's doing it in a crappy way. So it's the idea, what is the function of it? So of course, sometimes it is trying to motivate somebody or wanting them to be better at something, but in reality, of course, it's doing the opposite. So when you help somebody kind of understand that, then it's a little bit about how to use motivation or that safety or soothing system as a motivator instead.
Yeah, there's that sort of sense of threat that goes along with the voices, partly an external threat, which is kind of like the sort of the social, self-conscious, external factors that feel threatening. And then there's also, the internal, the self-criticism, the self-attacking, and altogether it just creates this very activated threat system and undermines, I guess, drive system and so on. And trying to develop the soothing affiliative system. I suppose that's a little bit what you were saying before, isn't it? Even in the group there becomes this experience of affiliation amongst the group, which just starts to create a little bit of a sense of belonging, being a part of the group. And then I suppose trying to see how can we really cultivate that or activate that part as well. Maybe the voices can be reframed. What's the function there, or at least what's the motive there? Maybe the motive isn't just about bringing me down, but is somehow, even maybe in a misguided way, but somehow trying to help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the most important things was to introduce that 3-circle model in the middle of the program, because it meant that they had at least 3 sessions together to get to know each other, and exactly like that, as you say, that affiliation, to kind of begin to build some of those bonds. So it made it safer to kind of have some of those conversations. I think the other thing about the group, though, as well, in terms of thinking about that, is the importance of having, of course, a co-facilitator. So you'd have somebody guiding, but then the other person. So I co-facilitated with an OT therapist from one of the headspaces that took part in the study, and she had a diploma in mindfulness meditation teaching, and then I kind of brought her up to speed really in terms of compassion and compassion focused therapy. But there was always one of us in terms of also kind of looking what's happening in the group as somebody was leading the practice. And there was I remember one young fella who looked agitated, and I just caught his attention and kind of just very kind of subtly kind of made an indication, as in, does he want to leave, or is he okay? And he gave me a sign back to say, actually, I want to stay with this. And he did, and he stayed with the practice, and he seemed to really settle. And then he chipped in terms of the conversation afterwards, and he said yes, that he had heard voices, he was particularly anxious and agitated, but he wanted to stay with it. And when he did that, actually he did begin to settle. Of course, as other individuals, there was one person at one point that, her best decision for her was to step outside the group for a moment, and come back in again if it was perhaps an exercise that just felt, for whatever was going on for that day, just a little bit beyond her scope. And that's okay. So really, people having the permission and also the confidence in terms of listening to their own wisdom. It's okay for me to stay with this practice, have the courage and see this through, or actually in this moment, it makes more sense to allow myself to stop and just take a pause for a moment. And it was really nice to be able to see the group being able to do that.
The 2 facilitators really allows for that kind of monitoring and that also subtle communication that's happening there. It's a beautiful little example with that young person who, it reminds me, of the metaphor of the sort of the child or sort of teenager out on the soccer field, and they take a big tumble and then they kind of hurt themselves, and they look over at maybe their mum or dad, and the mum or dad's going, like this, and then they're like, yeah, and then they keep going, sort of a thing. And those are lovely experiences when they can happen for kids and in families, but it's a little bit like that in the group, isn't it? You were able to just do a little check-in with him visually and so on, and he was able to go, yep, I'm okay, and keep going. It's a beautiful moment. And then sometimes people knew as well that actually a break was probably a good idea too, which is that sort of intrinsic wisdom that we try to work with. And then the last 2 or 3 sessions in the group, what particular skills or that sort of thing was happening there once the 3 circles model and some of that initial psychoeducation was done?
Yeah, it really was in terms of responding with compassion. So of course, in terms of whether that's about developing a more compassionate inner voice or kind of inner dialogue, that became much more reassuring in terms of, in terms of guiding them, in terms of what they needed in that kind of moment. We also did a practice where we asked people to pair up and to sit and actually each draw a moment of conflict or difficulty they had in a relationship, of course, something kind of mild to moderate that was relatively recent, but then also kind of give them that opportunity where there was a listener and a speaker. And, one person had to explain the situation and kind of what unfolded, and the other person, their role was to kind of mindfully listen. And really just giving a person an opportunity, first of all, is to be like, what's it like to be heard? When we don't jump in, we don't jump to conclusions, and we really listen to somebody. And then also for somebody in terms of, to tell their story uninterrupted. So really trying to help people in terms of bringing that mindfulness to communications and potentially, hopefully, to home and, their kind of social circle. And then other things was in terms of how do you motivate yourself with compassion, which of course the compassionate voice would help you to do too. And really looking at the role of self-criticism and how it does tend to undermine us. And I showed, of course, a couple of video clips, one of them being you may be familiar with, and many people will be familiar with, is how mindfulness empowers us. So the fable about, the 2 wolves, and which one do you feed? So the one that's kind of, either hostile or agitated, or the one that's more kind of wise or courageous or kind. And, the American fable being, in terms of you can't get into battle with the hostile one, you just simply have to observe it. But really to feed the one that's been wise and more courageous and, is going to guide you in a better direction. So I suppose really trying to use different modalities, in terms of, there's also the compassionate friend meditation. So, what would they give you? What would they say to you? If you had to draw upon the image of a compassionate friend. So we're really trying to mix it up in terms of how to help people learn. And the other thing, actually, just to mention there, that I was particularly conscious with was also the dosage of compassion. So, of course, we all know that for individuals who aren't familiar with compassion, that actually sometimes initial reaction, it can be quite difficult. It almost like it potentially activates a threat system because it's not familiar. So I really want to be conscious about that, particularly in a group setting. So also just making sure that we kept it, like in terms of a low to moderate kind of dose, that we weren't going to do so much compassion that the group is going to feel overwhelmed. So that was a really important thing to think about in terms of planning the program, and then also in terms of really gauging people, the responses, and getting their feedback.
I see. I was going to ask about the because the length of it was about 8 sessions, I think you said, and the first 4 sessions were really the mindfulness based stuff, and then the second 4 sessions, I guess, were more drawing on the CFT. But that was a conscious decision to just sort of keep the dosage nice and neat and kind of just to sort of not activate that kind of that threat system and give people a kind of a taster, I guess. And I can hear like multi modalities, as you were saying, but also the 3 flows, the self-reassuring and the metaphor of the 2 wolves and so on, exploring the self-compassion, that little kind of listening practice, exploring both receiving compassion and giving compassion. So yes, in amongst all of that comes the sort of the 3 flows or orientations there.
Yeah, very, very true. Yeah.
So what it sounds like it was received very well, but what were some of the little challenges there in terms of this group or this population? I mean, were there the fears, blocks, and resistances, or were there other little challenges that you noticed?
The first one that really springs to mind was really in terms of getting young people to get to know each other, to feel safe among a group. When we ran the first group, we did 90 minutes and we hadn't taken a break, and the feedback was they wanted to get to know other people more. So we thought, okay, I mean, we did the first 3 sessions deliberately having an icebreaker, because if somebody missed the first session and came along to the second, well, there's an icebreaker, so you still get to know everybody. I mean, you couldn't join after the second session, but of course, there's also a possibility there may be people in the third session who didn't know each other because somebody had missed the first or the second. So we made sure to do the whole 3. But still, young people, I suppose there's only so much you can set up to help them to get to know each other, but it's something they're particularly keen on. And getting to know people takes time. It's not something that you speed up, but we certainly want to facilitate it in whatever way we could in terms of helping them to get to know each other. So we decided to put a break in the middle. And the first time, and to leave the room. So if we left the room, of course, we weren't there for them to talk about, and we thought, well, they'll have to talk amongst themselves. They'll give them an opportunity to do so. And one of the things I never thought of course, was you come back in and they're all on their mobile phones. So I thought, oh, okay, we really need to, in terms of think about when we run the group, that's actually to say, can everybody put their mobile phone on silent, or can you turn it off, or do something where it was like this hour and a half without mobiles. So I think for young people, for me, that is the kind of key thing to be thinking about. And really from there on, the other thing I suppose is particular to young people is, when they talked about home practice, the majority of people never did those formal sittings. So we did suggest or invite them to meditate for 10 minutes a day. It was the minority who really kind of did that. But what most people did in the group, at least, was do those on the spot ones. So the stop practice. So you stop, you take a breath, observe how you're feeling, and then kind of ask yourself, what do I need before you proceed with your day? Or of course, like mindful walking or concentrating on the soles of your feet. So it was all the ones that were convenient in a way, or they could easily just blend into the day that they were practicing. So for me, those are the key things that would have really stuck out in terms of thinking about how to run or develop a program.
I just think that idea of 3 sessions starting with icebreakers is just ingenious. I've never thought of that before, but it's so clever, because you're right. Firstly, some people might miss a session or something, but also, it just gives everyone a chance to meet other people, and because the group dynamic and the sense of safeness in the group is so key. I mean, that just seems very clever. And I was going to say that the facilitators leaving the group during the break was ingenious too, but of course I didn't think of the mobile phones. So
neither do we.
it's so interesting, the modern world in a way. But yeah, you're putting a lot of effort, I guess, don't we? We need to put effort into trying to think, how can we create that sense of safeness in the group? And then absolutely the home practice. I mean, even the work I've done with more adult populations, the home practice is always an interesting challenge, trying to work out, what might it be that could really sort of help them feel engaged with that. Mind you, the more practical on the spot examples are really useful as well.
I think it's something that I do hope to continue to modify the program. And I think that would be a key thing in terms of thinking about how to modify the content of the program. Absolutely.
So for the nerds amongst us, like me, I guess I'm really curious about how the results went with the study itself, and to get a bit of a sense of the outcomes there. What did you find?
Joe, to be honest, it was because it was a small pilot study, I was a bit hesitant in terms of, analyzing the results. So when they came through, I mean, I was really pleased, not only in terms of, a number of findings being significant, but also in a way that I would have predicted and expected, which was fantastic. So really what we found, interesting actually, so we used the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire. There was only one subscale of that was significant, which was acting with awareness, which is really important. We wanted to help these young people to exactly that, be more aware of what they were doing. But in terms of self-compassion, that very much had a large significant effect, particularly around a reduction in self-judgment. That went down considerably. There was a large effect on that. And also an increase in self-kindness. The other things we found was in terms of anxiety, depression, stress went down. We used, for what you tend to use for the at-risk mental state in terms of assessing subclinical psychotic symptoms called the CARMS. And that actually showed that the subclinical psychotic symptoms had reduced, but particularly what was became our strongest in that was the distress associated with them actually had reduced. We also used the BPRS. Now, the full-blown psychotic symptoms on that particular scale actually that wasn't significant in terms of change, and I'm not too sure why at this stage. Maybe it's harder given, of course, that they're stronger and more intense symptoms, but certainly the stress associated with the psychotic symptoms reduced. Also, in terms of self-criticism went down, functioning went up, and I also looked at attachment. So while there was no change in people with an avoidant attachment, which probably wouldn't be that surprising, that people with an insecure attachment actually started to become more, there was an improvement on that component. One of the things that I found particularly interesting, though, so I had two supervisors, Professor Graham Meadows from Monash University, and he's particularly has been involved in MBCT teacher training, and Professor Barnaby Nelson from the University of Melbourne, so who also works in Origin Youth Health. So his expertise, particularly being the at-risk mental state and psychosis. And Barnaby had completed this study that actually showed that young people with an at-risk mental state who experience more distress due to their symptoms had a poorer trajectory. So in terms of diagnostic outcome, but also in terms of, how they generally just got on in life between school or jobs and so forth. So I thought, well, this is really important. It was quite a large study, and it was thinking, well, what's going on here that's particularly contributing to the distress? And they weren't too sure. So of course, as a pilot study, we don't have data to really kind of answer that question, but we certainly thought we'd kind of run a bit of an analysis just to look at even any association or trend or any indicators about what might be happening. And what we actually found was that the more person engaged in self-criticism, then the more distressed they became, which makes sense. And actually, the more they engage in self-reassurance, the stress was going down. So that's one of the things that we wrote a letter to the editor for schizophrenia research. And we wrote a letter to the editor, and we just pointed this out in terms of, we really feel like it's an area that could really do with some further explanation or exploration, with the, of course, a much fuller data set. But it certainly was a sense that potentially that may be one of the things that could happen. And of course, the ability of mindfulness or CFT to work with distress and the potential that could have for trajectory, it sounds very promising.
I mean, those are wonderful results. I mean, if you think about the sort of the active mindfulness increases, the self-compassion increases, or self-judgment reduces, people feel a little bit less down, a little bit less anxious and stressed and so on. And while their actual psychotic symptoms maybe don't change, their distress associated with those symptoms change. I mean, that's a beautiful picture, isn't it, of a beautiful picture of how things can change for them. And it sort of makes sense to me too, because often self-compassion isn't about fixing the certain experiences that we have in the mind, but rather just helping us shift how we relate to ourselves when we have those experiences. And so it seems to sort of bear out in your findings as well, that people are relating to themselves and to those symptoms a little bit differently, after the group. And amazing too, because 8 sessions is significant, and it's also in some ways a relatively brief intervention, 8 sessions, and yet all of those results. So how has this kind of sort of moved you or touched you personally? Your involvement in the world of mindfulness and compassion and self-compassion and some of this really significant work. How's it sort of ended up touching you?
It's interesting in some ways how it becomes really more widespread than even your self-compassion or relationship to yourself. I remember though being in a book club where we were discussing compassion books, and one of the things many of us could relate to was in our younger years, or certainly more critical. So very grateful there's been that transformation. But also I kind of think really importantly is also, how do we be compassionate, if you think about it more broadly. So, obviously in terms of climate change and, the major concerns that have been raised about that, and really how we can be more compassionate in our actions in terms of what we choose to consume or purchase. For me, that even extends in terms of our treatment of animals as well. So I feel for me, it's not only in terms of my relationship with myself, with the people kind of around me, but also more extensively in terms of who else we inhabit the planet with, other creatures, and then the planet itself. I would really love to see it kind of being more and more being thought about in that way.
Yes, ourselves, others around us, but also just other living beings and the planet itself. I know you do a lot of sort of advocacy in terms of animals and the treatment of animals, and especially I'm not sure what the correct term is, but sort of food animals, I suppose, and how we might sort of treat those living beings as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know it's not always the most topic that people like to discuss, and there's also a lot of before years ago I would have had less knowledge about as well, but it's one of those things when your eyes are open to it, you can't be shut to it again. So yeah, but I do think in terms of just thinking it on a very more global level. And if you think about, you know, a lot of us begin to kind of come towards compassion by first of all learning a simple loving kindness practice. So we're sending good wishes out to the world, and it, you know, some of them practices do the same thing, isn't it? It's for ourselves, for those we know well, those we know less well, and you know, and we begin to extend it out towards the planet. And I think it's no different in terms of thinking about compassion in that way.
No, I agree. Absolutely. So so yeah, tell us a bit about what's next. Do you have any other projects on the go, or things that you're interested in post the PhD? I know that PhDs can be rather a big deal, so you're probably also enjoying just having a little bit of a break. But yeah, what's next?
I'm an adjunct research fellow with Monash University at the moment. So the plan is very much, keep going. I'm looking at developing ideas that hopefully I can put through applications for grants. So particularly around this area of the program and youth, likely still at this particular stage. And I also have an honorary position with the University of Sydney. So that's where I've been doing some work with Professor James Bennett Levy in terms of self-practice, self-reflection for CFT practitioners. Mm-hmm. So, you know, of course, you know, what we're talking about earlier, you know, that kind of experiencing it from the inside out. So we have ran a number of online trainings and asked people who are very kindly given us their time in terms of completing some surveys afterwards. So we have that data in, we're currently looking at it, but I really not too sure. I don't have the results just yet. So yeah, looking forward to finding out what comes out of that.
And with the, have there been certain papers published from your PhD?
There has. So I think it's 5 that I've published so far. I actually have qualitative data, which, to be honest, that was a little accidental. I wanted some feedback and I got so much feedback. I was like, whoa, I got some qualitative data here, which was fantastic. So I'm currently writing that up, and that should be the 6th paper. So I have papers in terms of describing the rationale, then of course actually describing the program itself. And what I really love about that particular program is we employed one of the participants when we finished the program to co-write the paper with me. So I describe the session and then she describes her experience of the session. So it's a way that if people want to get familiar with the content of a program and participants' experience, then there's a paper on that. I then looked at the quantitative results, so some of the ones I've described to you there, the letter to the editor when we looked at the relationship of self-criticism and distress, and then also in terms of I also have this qualitative one that's in the pipeline.
So I might put the links to those in the description so that people can have a look at some of your great publications. And then also, it sounds like the supervision from the inside out work is now completed. You've collected all the data. So okay, so we'll look forward to hearing how that goes as well. So one of the things that I'm asking everyone, as you know, is just for their 3 tips. So I suppose I was curious to hear, and perhaps it's to do with your particular area of working with young people and at risk young people, or perhaps it's just, you know, more general ideas. But what would be 3 tips for those who are on their journey towards living a compassionate life?
Yeah. Look, I think one of the things is, first of all, I suppose if thinking about more compassionately in a way, isn't it, is, I know it might sound very basic, isn't it? But sometimes there's a real misunderstanding of what compassion actually is. So, you know, really kind of going back and having to think about that. So, you know, those 2 components, somebody has to be having a hard time or suffering or struggling. And then how do you respond to that with, you know, how do you respond to that with non-judgment, with courage, with wisdom, and at times kindness, because one of the things you say, sometimes it really takes a lot of courage, other times we really need to be kind to ourselves. So I really think going back to them core understanding and really kind of thinking about what that means for you in your life. Yeah, and from experience, perhaps because I've set the mindful self-compassion course, that actually starting with yourself is a really good place to start. I know there can be, again, confusion that people think it can be selfish, but if you look at any of the research, it shows that your own well-being is much better if you're self-compassion. Of course, that also means your relationship with others will be. And they also show that people who say rate their partners as more self-compassionate, they've actually been found to they find them more satisfied with their relationships. So other people benefit too, so it's not selfish whatsoever. And then again, I'd also think about it, as we're just kind of touched on a little while ago, about how do you extend that to those around you, to all the creatures that we share the planet with, and the planet itself. And I think that's where my 3 tips would lead me.
Those are wonderful. So really understanding kind of what compassion is and some of the nuance there, applying it to oneself, especially around both courage and strength and kindness and wisdom, and then extending it to the world.
Absolutely. just a small challenge.
Yeah. Exactly. All right. So I'll let you go in a moment, but if people were wanting to sort of connect with you or engage with you in your work, how can people find you?
Sure. I mean, even just simply Googling Tara Hickey, psychologist, will bring up a number of hits. But in terms of where I'm doing my private practice, it's VCPS. And certainly that's one way to contact me, or even through whether my work with Monash Uni either. So, but I'm relatively present on the web, so it wouldn't be hard to find me in that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds great. Well, I really, that was sort of fun and inspiring to get a chance to actually spend a bit of time really hearing about what you've been up to. I mean, it's a very important area of work and a great niche really that you're establishing there. It'll be interesting to see how that continues to develop. So thank you very much, Tara.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
It's really wonderful. So we'll talk again soon.
Sounds good.